She began alone in the narrow streets of Strasbourg, her feet moving to music only she could hear. Frau Troffea, a name history would never forget, stepped and swayed in the oppressive July heat of 1518, her body betraying her mind in a rhythm that seemed torn from hell itself. By sunset, her feet were bleeding. By dawn, she had not stopped, and by week's end, 34 others had joined her macabre ballet, their bodies enslaved to the same inexplicable compulsion that would kill them. This was no celebration. This was the dancing plague, a phenomenon so bizarre, so utterly inexplicable, that even now, 5 centuries later, it defies rational explanation and haunts the edges of historical understanding. The cobblestones of medieval Europe would echo with the sound of feet that could not stop moving, bodies that had become prisoners of their own limbs, minds trapped in flesh that danced relentlessly toward death. What began as one woman's inexplicable compulsion would become a contagion of movement that swept through communities like a plague of possessed marionettes, their strings pulled by forces beyond human comprehension. In the sweltering summer of 1518, Strasbourg was a city balanced on the knife's edge of catastrophe. Famine had stalked the region for years, leaving the population malnourished and desperate. Disease festered in the overcrowded quarters where the poor huddled together, their bodies weakened by hunger and their minds frayed by constant uncertainty. Into this cauldron of human misery came Frau Troffea's dance, a spark that would ignite an inferno of collective madness. The medieval chroniclers who witnessed these events struggled to find words adequate to describe what they saw. "She danced as one possessed," wrote one observer, "her limbs moving with such violence that bones could be heard cracking within her flesh. Her eyes rolled back until only white showed, and from her lips came sounds no Christian throat should utter." But Frau Troffea was only the beginning. Within days, others began to join her in the streets, men and women, young and old, abandoning their daily routines to dance with the same frenzied intensity. They moved without pause, without rest, their bodies contorting in ways that seemed to defy the limitations of human anatomy. The dancing mania of Strasbourg represents one of history's most documented yet least understood episodes of mass psychogenic illness, observes historian John Waller. We have detailed accounts from multiple witnesses, civic records, and medical observations, yet the phenomenon remains fundamentally mysterious. The city authorities initially dismissed the dancing as a temporary aberration, perhaps even beneficial, a way for the stressed population to release their anxieties through physical expression. Some suggested it was divine intervention, God's way of purging the community of sin through ecstatic movement. Others whispered of witchcraft, of demonic possession, of curses unleashed by enemies of the city. As the dancers multiplied, the authorities' attitudes shifted from curiosity to concern to outright terror. By the end of the first week, dozens were dancing. By the second week, the number had swelled to over 100. The streets of Strasbourg became a theater of the grotesque, filled with figures whose movements had lost all resemblance to human dance and had become something far more disturbing. The dancers moved in ways that violated natural motion. Their heads jerked violently from side to side. Their arms flailed with such force that shoulders dislocated. Their legs kicked and stamped until the cobblestones grew slick with blood from their torn feet. And through it all, they could not stop. Those who attempted to restrain the dancers found themselves overwhelmed by supernatural strength. Women who had been weakened by hunger displayed the power of madmen, throwing off multiple restrainers with ease. Men who had been gentle craftsmen became violent when anyone tried to interrupt their movement, striking out with fists and feet while never breaking the rhythm of their dance. The medical understanding of the time was woefully inadequate to explain what was happening. Physicians examined the dancers and found their pulses racing, their breathing labored, their bodies burning with fever. Yet conventional treatments, bloodletting, purging, the application of leeches, had no effect whatsoever on the compulsion to dance. What we witnessed in Strasbourg is the intersection of social stress, mass suggestion, and neurological dysfunction, explains medical historian Edward Shorter. The dancing plague represents a perfect storm of psychological and physiological factors that created a self-perpetuating cycle of collective madness. The city authorities, desperate to find a solution, consulted with physicians, clergy, and scholars from across the region. The diagnosis they received was both chilling and bizarre. The dancers were suffering from hot blood, a condition that could only be cured by more dancing. The physicians recommended that the city provide musicians and a proper venue for the afflicted to dance until the malady burned itself out. This decision would prove catastrophic. The authorities constructed a wooden stage in the city center and hired professional musicians to play for the dancers. They believed that organized musical dancing would be less harmful than the chaotic, silent gyrations that had been occurring in the streets. They were wrong. The music seemed to amplify the contagion. The rhythmic beats provided a structure for the madness, transforming individual episodes of compulsive movement into a coordinated mass phenomenon. More people began to dance. The infection spread beyond Strasbourg's walls, carried by travelers who had witnessed the events and somehow absorbed the compulsion themselves. The dancers moved in formations that defied choreography. They formed circles that broke apart and reformed in patterns that seemed almost ritualistic, as if following instructions from voices only they could hear. Some observers reported that the dancers seemed to be responding to music that wasn't being played, their movements perfectly synchronized to rhythms that existed only in their fevered minds. The stage became an altar of human sacrifice, wrote one horrified witness, where bodies were offered up to forces beyond our understanding. The music did not heal them. It summoned something that fed upon their flesh and spirit until nothing remained but movement itself. As the days turned into weeks, the true horror of the situation became apparent. The dancers were dying. Not all at once, but gradually, their bodies succumbing to exhaustion, dehydration, and the sheer physical trauma of their ceaseless movement. Some collapsed from heart failure, their hearts unable to sustain the relentless pace. Others died from strokes, their brains hemorrhaging under the strain of continuous exertion. The most disturbing deaths were those who simply danced until they wore away. Their feet, already torn and bleeding, would be ground down to bone against the wooden stage. Their legs would break under the constant impact, yet they would continue to move, dragging their shattered limbs behind them as they maintained the rhythm that had become more important than life itself. Contemporary accounts describe scenes that border on the apocalyptic. The stage was slick with blood and littered with pieces of torn flesh. The air reeked of sweat, blood, and human waste as the dancers lost control of their bodily functions but continued to move. The sound was equally horrifying. Not just the music and the stamping of feet, but the groans of the dying, the crack of breaking bones, and an eerie humming that seemed to emanate from the dancers themselves. Yet perhaps most disturbing of all was the reaction of the spectators. Rather than being repelled by the horror unfolding before them, crowds gathered daily to watch the dancing. Some came out of morbid curiosity, others seemed hypnotically drawn to the spectacle, swaying in place as they watched, their own bodies beginning to respond to the infectious rhythm. The boundary between performer and audience began to dissolve, notes cultural historian Hillel Schwartz. The dancing plague created a feedback loop where observation became participation, where witnessing the madness was itself a form of contagion. Several observers reported feeling compelled to join the dancers, describing an almost irresistible urge to step onto the stage and surrender to the movement. Some did succumb, abandoning their positions as spectators to become part of the dance. The contagion was spreading not just through physical proximity, but through the act of witnessing itself. The civic authorities, realizing their mistake, eventually banned the music and dismantled the stage. But by then, the damage was done. The dancing had spread beyond Strasbourg to neighboring towns and villages. Reports came in of similar outbreaks across the Rhine Valley, each following the same pattern, beginning with a single dancer, growing into a community-wide phenomenon, and ending in death and social disruption. What makes the dancing plague particularly mysterious is its selectivity. Not everyone exposed to the dances became infected. The contagion seemed to target specific individuals, often women, often from the lower social classes, often those already suffering from stress, malnutrition, or social isolation. This pattern suggests that the dancing plague was not simply a matter of mass hysteria, but something more complex, involving factors that researchers are still struggling to understand. Some modern scholars have proposed neurological explanations. The dancing movements described in medieval accounts are consistent with various forms of movement disorders, including Huntington's disease, Sydenham's chorea, and temporal lobe epilepsy. The infectious nature of the phenomenon could be explained by mass psychogenic illness, a condition where psychological stress manifests as physical symptoms that spread through social groups. Others have suggested environmental factors. The ergot fungus, which we now know can cause hallucinations and compulsive movements, thrived in the damp conditions that preceded many dancing plague outbreaks. The malnutrition common in medieval communities could have made populations more susceptible to various forms of neurological dysfunction. The dancing plague defies simple explanation because it operates at the intersection of neurology, psychology, sociology, and possibly toxicology, argues researcher Robert Bartholomew. It's a multifactorial phenomenon that reveals the complex ways in which individual pathology can become collective madness. But the most unsettling aspect of the dancing plague may be its apparent randomness. Unlike other medieval phenomena that can be explained by specific social or environmental factors, the dancing outbreaks seemed to emerge without warning and disappear just as suddenly. Communities that had been stable for generations would suddenly explode into collective madness, then return to normalcy as if nothing had happened. The last major outbreak of dancing plague occurred in the early 17th century, though smaller episodes continued to be reported well into the 18th century. As European society became more urbanized and medically sophisticated, the conditions that gave rise to dancing plagues seemed to fade away. The phenomenon retreated into history, leaving behind only scattered accounts and a lingering mystery that continues to baffle researchers. Yet the dancing plague's legacy extends beyond medical curiosity. It represents something fundamental about human nature, our capacity for collective madness, our vulnerability to social contagion, our ability to surrender individual agency to group behavior. In an age of social media and viral phenomena, the dancing plague offers insights into how ideas and behaviors can spread through populations with frightening speed and devastating consequences. The dancing plague reminds us that the line between sanity and madness, between individual and collective behavior, is far thinner than we like to believe, observes social psychologist Leon Festinger. Under the right conditions, any community can become a stage for forces beyond rational control. Modern incidents of mass psychogenic illness, from the laughing epidemic of Tanganyika to the recent cases of social media-induced tics among teenagers, suggest that the mechanisms underlying the dancing plague are still active in human societies. We may have better medical understanding and more sophisticated social institutions, but we remain susceptible to the same forces that drove medieval Europeans to dance themselves to death. The cobblestones of Strasbourg no longer echo with the sound of bleeding feet, but the capacity for collective madness remains embedded in human nature. The dancing plague stands as a reminder that civilization is a thin veneer over deeper, more primitive forces that can erupt without warning and consume entire communities in their fury.